Dad, I already committed to the girls' trip. The doctor thing can wait a few days, right? That was the sentence that changed everything. Not cruel exactly, said quickly, distractedly, my daughter already halfway out the door with a suitcase in hand, treating the appointment where I'd learn the results of my biopsy as a scheduling inconvenience rather than the single most important hour of my week. But we'll get there. 1 week later, I was sitting across from her at my own kitchen table, watching her slide a folder toward me containing wedding invitation proofs, asking, with genuine hope in her eyes, whether I'd walk her down the aisle in 4 months and give her my blessing for a marriage she clearly wanted very badly for me to approve of. And I remember looking at that folder, then at her face, and feeling the full, complicated weight of everything that had happened in the 7 days between those two moments settle into my chest all at once. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Warren Castellano. I'm 68 years old. I live alone now in a small house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the same house my wife Linda and I bought 39 years ago, raising our daughter Jessica in the bedroom down the hall that's mostly used for storage these days. Linda passed 6 years ago, quickly, from a stroke that gave none of us any warning at all. One Tuesday she was standing in the kitchen complaining, cheerfully, about the price of tomatoes at the grocery store, and by Thursday she was gone, and I have spent the years since learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be a man living alone after 4 decades of not being one. I worked 36 years as a high school shop teacher, a job I loved more than I ever fully articulated to anyone, teaching generations of kids how to safely operate a table saw and, more importantly I always felt, how to be patient with work that doesn't come together on the first try. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in watching a 15-year-old who thinks he's terrible at everything discover, over the course of a semester, that his hands are capable of building something real and useful. I missed that more than I expected to when I retired 4 years ago. Since then, my days have taken on a quieter, slower rhythm. Coffee on the porch, a standing Tuesday breakfast with 2 old colleagues from the school, Ray and Dominic, and the particular kind of contentment that comes from a life well lived, even if it's grown considerably quieter than it used to be. I keep Linda's garden going, mostly out of stubbornness, even though I've never had her gift for it, and half the tomatoes I grow each summer are smaller and sadder than the ones she used to coax out of that same soil. Jessica is 29 now, engaged to a good man named Michael, and building a career in marketing that keeps her busier than I sometimes wish she were. I've always been proud of her, genuinely proud, even in the years since Linda passed when our relationship has occasionally felt more like a series of scheduled check-ins than the closeness we once had. She calls on Sundays, usually for 15 or 20 minutes, and I've grown accustomed to that rhythm without ever quite admitting to myself how much I wished it were more. I want to be careful about how I tell this next part, because I don't think Jessica is a cruel person, and I don't want this story to sound like an indictment of her character. She's simply, like a lot of people her age, living a full, demanding life, one that doesn't always leave room for the kind of attentiveness that aging parents sometimes need more of than they're willing to ask for directly. 6 weeks before all of this, I'd gone in for a routine screening, the kind of appointment you schedule reluctantly, on your doctor's insistence, and mostly expect to walk away from with nothing more than a clean bill of health and a reminder to eat more vegetables. Instead, the doctor's expression shifted somewhere in the middle of it, that particular professional stillness doctors adopt when something needs a closer look, and within the week I'd been scheduled for a biopsy. I didn't tell Jessica right away. I want to be honest about that. I sat with it alone for nearly 2 weeks, turning it over at night, staring at the ceiling in the bedroom Linda and I had shared for 39 years, before I finally called my daughter and told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I needed a biopsy and that the follow-up appointment, where I'd learn the actual results, was set for a Thursday 3 weeks out. I'd appreciate you coming with me, I told her, trying to keep my voice light, or at the very least, being reachable that afternoon, in case the news is difficult. Of course, Dad, she said. I'll clear my schedule. I remember feeling in that moment a genuine relief, the particular comfort of not having to face something frightening entirely alone. I held on to that relief for exactly 10 days. 10 days later, she called to tell me that a group of her closest college friends had organized a girls' trip to a lake house for that same week, an annual tradition that had, this particular year, landed directly on top of my appointment date. I feel terrible about the timing, she said, but this is the one weekend everyone could actually make work, and I already told them I'd come. Can we maybe just talk on the phone after your appointment instead? I told her it was fine. I want to be honest and tell you it wasn't entirely fine, but I've spent a lifetime not wanting to be the father who guilts his daughter into changing plans, and I told myself, the way people in my position often do, that a phone call afterward was a reasonable compromise. I hung up the phone that evening and sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, the way I imagine a lot of quiet, undemanding parents do, quietly rearranging their own disappointment into something more palatable, something they can live inside without having to name it out loud to anyone. I mentioned it to Ray at our Tuesday breakfast, carefully, the way men of my generation mention things that actually matter to us, sideways, almost accidentally, in the middle of a conversation, ostensibly about something else entirely. She's got a trip planned the same week as my results appointment, I said, stirring my coffee longer than it needed stirring. Ray, who'd lost his own wife 2 years before I lost Linda, and who understood the particular loneliness of aging without a spouse better than almost anyone I knew, just looked at me for a moment. You going to tell her that bothers you? It's a lake house weekend with her college friends, Ray. It's not like she's choosing something frivolous over me. That's not what I asked, he said. I didn't have a good answer for him that morning, and we moved on to talking about the Phillies instead, the way men our age do when a conversation gets closer to something honest than either of us is quite ready for. The appointment fell on a Thursday. I drove myself, sat alone in a small examination room decorated with the particular sterile cheerfulness of medical offices everywhere, and listened to my doctor explain, gently but directly, that the biopsy had confirmed early-stage cancer, treatable, she said, with a genuinely good prognosis given how early it had been caught. But cancer nonetheless, a word that lands with a particular weight no matter how many reassuring qualifiers surround it. I sat in my truck in the parking lot afterward for almost 10 minutes before I called Jessica, the way we'd planned. My hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady on the phone. She answered on the second ring, background noise suggesting she was in the middle of some lake house activity, laughter, music, the particular carefree din of a group of 30-year-olds enjoying a weekend away from their responsibilities. "Hey, Dad, how'd it go?" she asked, and I could hear, underneath the casual tone, that she hadn't fully absorbed the significance of the day, that some part of her mind was still at that lake house, even while she asked the question. "It's cancer, Jessica," I said. "Early stage. Treatable, they think, but it's cancer." There was a pause, and then genuine alarm entered her voice, the alarm I'd expected from the start. "Oh my God, Dad. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come home right now? I can leave tonight. I want to be honest about why what happened next happened, because it wasn't entirely generous on my part." "You don't need to cut your trip short," I said. Some part of me, in that moment, wanted to see whether she'd insist anyway, whether the offer was reflexive politeness or genuine intention. I think, somewhere underneath the words, I was testing something I didn't yet have the courage to ask directly. "Okay," she said, after a pause that told me everything I needed to know. "If you're sure, I'll call you every day, I promise, and I'll be there for every appointment from here on out." I want to tell you honestly what happened in me during that phone call, because I think it matters. I didn't feel rage, exactly. I felt something quieter and, in its own way, harder to sit with, a kind of confirmed loneliness, the specific ache of realizing that the person you most wanted beside you on the worst day of your recent life had decided, even gently, even with real remorse in her voice, that a lake house weekend took priority. I sat in that parking lot for another few minutes after we hung up, watching other people walk in and out of the medical building with their own private weights to carry, and then I drove myself home to an empty house and made myself dinner I didn't particularly want to eat. She did call every day for the rest of that week, as promised, conversations that were warm and genuinely concerned, but that never quite closed the gap I'd felt standing alone in that parking lot. I told myself I was being unreasonable. I told myself this several times a day, actually, and mostly succeeded in believing it during daylight hours. It was the nights that were harder to talk myself out of it. Lying in the bed Linda and I had shared, listening to the particular silence of a house built for 3 people and now holding only one. Turning the diagnosis over in my mind, alongside the memory of my daughter's laughter and the lake house music playing faintly behind her voice on the phone. I saw Ray again that Tuesday, at our usual breakfast spot, and he must have read something in my face before I'd said a single word, because he set down his coffee and just waited, the way old friends do when they can tell a conversation is about to arrive whether you're ready for it or not. They confirmed it, I told him. Cancer. Early stage, treatable, but it's real. Ray reached across the table and gripped my forearm. Hard. The kind of gesture men our age don't often make, and mean every bit as much for how rarely we allow ourselves to. Warren, I'm so sorry. Was Jessica there with you? She was at a lake house with her friends, I said, and I heard, even as I said it, how carefully neutral I was trying to keep my voice, and how badly I was failing at it. Ray didn't say anything cruel about my daughter. He'd known her since she was 6 years old, used to slip her butterscotch candies at school assemblies, and he wasn't about to start speaking ill of her now. But he also didn't let me brush past it the way I'd been trying to brush past it all week. You told me a few weeks back you asked her to be there, he said. Did you tell her straight out how much it actually mattered to you? Or did you do the thing you always do, where you make it sound optional so nobody has to feel obligated? I didn't have a good answer for him. I'd spent 39 years of marriage and 29 years of fatherhood perfecting the art of making my own needs sound like polite suggestions, easy enough to decline without guilt, and it had never once occurred to me, until Ray said it plainly across a diner table, that this habit might be costing me exactly the kind of presence I most wanted from the people I loved. I think I made it too easy for her to say no, I admitted. Then maybe that's worth telling her, Ray said. Not to make her feel guilty, just so she actually knows, the next time it matters, that it's fine, you don't have to. Doesn't mean what she's probably assumed it means for years. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the week, turning it over the way I used to turn over a piece of unfinished furniture in my shop classroom, looking for the flaw in the joinery before I could figure out how to fix it. 1 week later, almost to the day, Jessica came by my house with a folder of wedding invitation proofs, glowing with the particular excitement of a bride finalizing details for a wedding 4 months away. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, sliding the folder toward me, and said, Dad, I know this timing might feel strange given everything with your diagnosis, but Michael and I really want your blessing, properly, before we finalize anything. Will you walk me down the aisle? I want to describe what happened in me in that moment, because I think it's the actual heart of this story, more than the diagnosis itself or the missed appointment. I looked at my daughter's hopeful, expectant face, at the invitation proofs with our family's name printed alongside Michael's, and I felt the full weight of the previous week settle into a single, difficult question I hadn't fully allowed myself to ask until that exact moment. Could I give my genuine blessing to a marriage? Could I walk my daughter down an aisle with an open heart, while still carrying the specific hurt of learning, so recently and so plainly, where I actually ranked against a lake house weekend? I sat with the folder unopened in front of me for longer than was comfortable for either of us. Jessica, I said, before I answer that, I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just apologize your way past it the way we've both been doing all week. She went still, sensing correctly that this conversation was about to become more serious than she'd anticipated. When I called you from that parking lot, I said, and told you I had cancer, you asked if I wanted you to come home, and when I said you didn't need to, you agreed pretty quickly. I understand I gave you an easy exit, but Jessica, I wanted you to fight me on it. I wanted you to say, Dad, I'm coming home regardless of what you say, because you just told me you have cancer, and you didn't. You took the exit I offered, and some part of me has been sitting with that ever since. Tears had started down her face by then. Dad, I've felt sick about this all week. I don't have a good excuse. I panicked, and I let the trip feel more urgent in the moment than it actually was. And by the time I really processed what you'd told me, I was already 3 states away, and it felt too late to undo the decision. I'm not trying to punish you for it, I said. I'm 68 years old, Jessica. I don't have unlimited time left to pretend hurts like this don't matter, hoping they'll quietly resolve themselves. I need you to understand what that week actually cost me before we talk about blessings and aisles and any of the rest of it. I understand, she said, though I could tell, gently, that she didn't yet. Not fully, not in the way that takes more than a single tearful conversation to arrive at. I don't think you do. Not completely, I said, as gently as I could manage. I think you understand that you hurt my feelings. I need you to understand something bigger than that. Since your mother died, I've tried very hard to be the parent who doesn't need much, who's steady, who doesn't ask for things, who lets you build your own life without the weight of an aging father's needs pulling at you. I've been proud of managing that. But somewhere along the way, I think you started mistaking my not asking for not needing, and those aren't the same thing, Jessica. They were never the same thing. She was crying harder now, and I let the silence sit there for a moment before continuing, because I think some things need room before more words arrive to crowd them out. I'm not asking you to feel guilty forever, I said. I'm asking you to actually sit with what happened, instead of moving past it as fast as possible because it's uncomfortable. That's the only thing I'm asking for right now. The weeks that followed were their own kind of difficult. There's a version of this story where that kitchen table conversation is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Jessica canceling a work trip 2 weeks later, without being asked, to attend my first treatment appointment, sitting in the waiting room with a book she didn't end up reading a single page of, because she spent the whole time watching the door instead. It's long, honest phone calls where she asked, for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit, real questions about how I was actually doing, not the polite surface-level check-ins we'd both grown accustomed to since Linda passed. How are you sleeping, actually? She'd ask, and wait for a real answer instead of the automatic fine I'd been offering for years. I think I've been treating you like a fixed point on the map since Mom died, Jessica admitted, about a month into my treatment, sitting on my porch on a Sunday evening that had, for the first time in a long time, turned into more than 15 minutes. Someone steady who'd always be there, so steady that I stopped actively showing up the way I used to, because some part of me assumed you didn't need it the way you used to. I think that's an honest way to put it, I said. And I think, if I'm honest too, I let that assumption take root because it was easier than telling you, plainly, when I actually needed you to show up. I'm as much a part of this pattern as you are, Jessica. I taught you, without ever meaning to, that I was low maintenance. I just never realized what that lesson would cost either of us when it actually mattered. There was an afternoon, about 6 weeks after that kitchen table conversation, when Jessica came by unannounced, sitting with me through an entire afternoon of chemotherapy side effects that weren't especially pleasant to witness, holding a bucket at one particularly difficult moment, without a trace of the squeamishness I might have expected from her, wiping my forehead with a cool cloth the way her mother used to do for both of us when either one of us was sick. I keep thinking about that lake house, she said quietly, during a calmer stretch of that afternoon. How badly I wanted to protect that one weekend, and how small it feels now compared to this. You don't need to keep punishing yourself over it, I said. I've made my peace with the choice you made that week. What I needed was for you to understand why it hurt, not to spend the rest of the year atoning for it. Michael, to his credit, started coming to some of the appointments too, quietly, without making a production of it. Sitting in waiting rooms, driving me home on days Jessica couldn't make it, never once treating it as an obligation rather than simply the ordinary work of becoming part of a family. I found myself, over those months, growing genuinely fond of him in a way I hadn't fully let myself before, perhaps because some guarded part of me had been keeping my son-in-law-to-be at the same polite, managed distance I'd been keeping everyone at since Linda died. "You know," I told him one afternoon, waiting for lab results in a quiet corner of the hospital, "Linda would have liked how you show up for people. She always said that was the real test of a person's character, not the big gestures, the small, consistent ones nobody's keeping score of." "I hope I get to meet the standard she set," he said, and I believed, watching him say it, that he genuinely would. There was one treatment session, near the middle of the whole process, that I think about more than the others. I'd had a rough reaction to that round of chemo, worse nausea than usual, a bone-deep exhaustion that made even holding a conversation feel like physical labor. And Jessica had come straight from work, still in her office clothes, and sat on the floor beside the recliner, because the single visitor chair in the room was occupied by a bag of my own belongings she hadn't bothered to move. "You don't have to sit on the floor," I told her, my voice thin. "I know," she said, and stayed exactly where she was. At some point that afternoon, half asleep and not entirely tracking my own words, I started talking about Linda, about the tomatoes in the garden, about the particular sound her laugh used to make, about a fight we'd had in 1991 that I could no longer even remember the substance of, only the fact that we'd made up over pancakes the next morning and never spoke of it again. Jessica just listened, holding my hand, letting me ramble through memories in whatever order the medication surfaced them in, and I remember thinking, somewhere in the haze of that afternoon, that this exact kind of unglamorous, uncomfortable presence was the thing I'd actually been asking for all along, far more than I'd ever been asking for a scheduling accommodation. "I'm sorry I wasn't the one holding your hand in that parking lot," she said quietly, once I'd gone quiet myself. "I keep coming back to it. I think I will for a long time." "Then let it change something," I said, "instead of just weighing on you. That's the only version of sorry that actually matters to me, Jessica." I didn't feel triumphant when I finally gave Jessica my blessing for the wedding. About 2 months after that kitchen table conversation, my treatment progressing well by then, the prognosis holding steady at genuinely encouraging. I want to be honest about that too. I felt, mostly, a quiet, hard-won kind of peace. The peace that comes after a difficult conversation actually gets had, rather than avoided in favor of comfortable politeness. We were sitting at that same kitchen table, the invitation proof still sitting between us from 2 months earlier, a little worn now at the corners from having been picked up and set back down so many times in the interim. "Yes," I told her, "I'll walk you down the aisle, Jessica. Not because the hurt from that week disappeared entirely. Because you actually sat with it instead of rushing past it, and that matters more to me than a perfect record of never having disappointed me in the first place." She cried again, differently this time, and I let her, the way I'd learned to let Linda cry when tears needed room before words could follow them. "I want you to know something else," I added, once she'd caught her breath. "I'm not telling you this to relitigate the lake house one more time. I'm telling you because I think it's important for whatever marriage you're about to build. Michael needs to know, someday, when he's disappointed you or fallen short of something you needed, and he will, Jessica, because every person who loves another person eventually does, that the healthiest thing either of you can do is exactly what we did at this table. Say the hard thing plainly. Let the other person actually feel it, instead of rushing them past their own hurt because it's uncomfortable to witness. That's not cruelty. That's what real intimacy actually requires." "I'll remember that," she said. "I think I needed to hear it from you before I hear it from anyone else." A few weeks before the wedding, Jessica asked me to come with her to her final dress fitting. An unusual request, she admitted, since it's traditionally something brides do with their mothers, not their fathers. But Linda wasn't there to fill that role, and Jessica said, quietly, that she wanted me there anyway, in whatever capacity made sense for the two of us. I sat in an uncomfortable little chair outside the fitting room for the better part of an hour, and when Jessica finally emerged in the dress, fully assembled for the first time, I felt something in my chest give way entirely. The particular collision of pride and grief that comes from watching your child become an adult in a moment her mother should have been standing beside you to witness. You look like her, I said, my voice not entirely steady. You look exactly like your mother did in her wedding photos. I've never told you that before because I don't think I've ever let myself really look at you and see it until right now. Jessica sat down beside me in the little chair, dress and all, careless of the fabric, and took my hand. I wish she could be here, she said. She is, I told her. In the stubborn way you refuse to let that lake house weekend just quietly disappear into the past unexamined. Your mother never let me get away with comfortable avoidance either. That part of her is very much alive in you, whether you always appreciate it or not. The seamstress came back in a few minutes later to make her final adjustments, and while she pinned the hem, Jessica kept talking, quietly, almost as if she were thinking out loud rather than addressing me directly. Michael asked me last week what I was most afraid of, going into the wedding, she said, and I told him I was afraid of becoming the kind of person who lets the people she loves quietly disappear into the background of her own busy life, the way I almost let you. He asked me what I was going to do about that fear, and I didn't have a good answer at the time, but I think I do now. What's the answer? I asked. I'm going to keep having the uncomfortable conversation, she said. Every time, instead of only when it becomes impossible to avoid. I don't want it to take another diagnosis for me to actually show up the way you deserve, Dad, or the way Michael deserves for that matter, or the way our kids will deserve, someday, if we're lucky enough to have them. I sat with that for a moment, watching my daughter in her mother's near-mirror image, pinned and adjusted under the fitting room lights, and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled since that phone call in the parking lot. Not because the hurt had vanished. Exactly. But because I finally believed, completely, that she'd actually understood it, rather than simply apologized her way past it. Your mother would be proud of that answer, I told her. For what it's worth, so am I. It's been almost a year now since that phone call in the parking lot. My treatment finished 4 months ago, with results my doctor describes, cautiously but genuinely, as excellent. Jessica and Michael got married 6 weeks after that dress fitting, on a warm October afternoon, and I walked my daughter down the aisle in a suit I'd been fitted for, looking forward to wearing it for reasons that went well beyond the wedding itself. I gave a short toast at the reception, shorter than most of the guests probably expected from the father of the bride, because I've never been a man of many words at podiums. I told the room that a wedding is really just a public promise to keep choosing someone, deliberately, on the ordinary days as well as the extraordinary ones, and that I'd learned, over the past year, exactly how much that kind of deliberate choosing actually costs, and exactly how much it's worth. I looked at Jessica while I said it, and I think she understood, the way only she could, everything the toast wasn't saying directly. Ray was there too, sitting near the back with Dominic, and he caught my eye during the first dance and raised his glass slightly. A small, private acknowledgement of a diner conversation from almost a year earlier that had, in its own quiet way, helped set all of this in motion. Jessica calls most days now real conversations rather than the polite check-ins we'd settled into after Linda passed. She asked me, a few weeks after the wedding, whether I resented her for that lake house weekend, whether some part of me would carry it forward, coloring our relationship with old hurt. I don't think resentment is the right word anymore, I told her. I think what happened is that you finally understood something I'd needed you to understand for longer than either of us realized, and understanding costs something to arrive at honestly. I'd rather have an honest, hard-won closeness with my daughter than a comfortable distance neither of us ever examined. I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply stop actively seeing, not because they're hiding anything, but because grief and time and the ordinary business of life quietly reshape our assumptions about what they need from us, until steady starts to feel like doesn't require much. Jessica didn't set out to prioritize a lake house over my diagnosis. She simply let years of assuming I was a fixed, low-maintenance point in her life calcify into a decision that, when it actually mattered, put me second. I don't regret the conversation I forced at that kitchen table, even though it complicated what should have been a simple, joyful moment about her wedding. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I didn't just accept her apology and move forward without making her sit in the discomfort of what she'd actually done. I think some moments require exactly that discomfort, honestly delivered and honestly received, in order for real change to actually take root, rather than simply fade into another polite, comfortable dynamic that quietly repeats itself the next time something serious happens. What I've learned watching my daughter show up consistently in the months since that conversation is that sometimes the people we love need to be told plainly, in the moment it actually happens, exactly what their absence costs us, rather than left to gradually piece it together on their own timeline, if they ever do at all. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. Don't let a lifetime of being the reliable, low-maintenance parent convince you that your own hard moments don't deserve someone else rearranging their plans for you. And if you're the one who's had to choose between a commitment and a parent's difficult appointment, choose the parent, every time you possibly can, because the version of steady they've let you believe about them is very often a kindness they've been quietly extending you for years, not a reflection of how little they actually need you. Subscribe to Silent Honor for new stories every week. Real strength, quiet dignity, and the moments when the truth finally speaks louder than years of silence. Disclaimer: this is a fictional, dramatized story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.